Hi, Todd Burns here. Today I'm going to talk about foam. We get a lot of questions about foam on our websites and at Homebrew Happy Hour. So we thought it would be good to do a video talking about foam and how to control foam. Because foam is a problem. The perfect beer. It's got a nice head. This is what we're looking for, not a glass full of foam when we first pour the beer. So we're going to talk about the three things that cause foam, or the three main things that cause foam. The first one is restriction. There's also temperature, and then there's the carbonation level of the beer itself. I'm going to go ahead and start with restriction. So restriction is basically restricting the flow of the beer, and it can be achieved in a variety of ways. The most popular in the United States is by using the hose inside diameter and the length of the hose. This is the most common. This is 3/16. You can see it's very narrow. Then we get into quarter, and then we get into 5/16. Now these quarters are very, very different because one of them is extremely hard durometer and the other one's soft. And it's actually a dual durometer, which just means, durometer means the amount of hardness. So the very, very hard one gives almost no restriction, whereas this one gives you a pretty good amount of restriction. The other way that you can control foam is with flow control, which is what we have here. So you just turn this lever, and what that does, if you can see here on the one that's actually off, this pushes this cone in and out. This cone being pushed in and out is going into the similar shaped shank, so that as you push it in more, it restricts the beer more and more to the point where you can completely stop the flow. This eliminates the need for restricting it all via hose, and in that case you want to use a fairly large hose like this 5/16 ID so that you provide full flow to the faucet. Then you can maximize your pour as you're pouring the beer. I wanted to quickly go over a couple of other configurations that are very common. Most of us at some point in our lives have attended a keg party, and we've seen this faucet. This faucet is what people call a picnic tap. There's several names for it, and you push down on this and that opens up and allows the beer to flow. One thing that's important on these is that a lot of people, if they're getting foam, which is very common on this faucet, they'll say, well, it's foaming, so I'm just going to pour down on it a little bit and not pour so much beer at one time. This has exactly the opposite effect. This causes a lot of turbulence, not restriction, so you end up getting more foam. So if you are using one of these, you're better to push it all the way down and maybe control a little bit the amount of pressure going to the keg. That can help you somewhat in reducing the foam. The ultimate solution is, instead of having this $3 piece of equipment, you have a $50 piece of equipment, which sounds somewhat counterintuitive, but it's worth it because you can completely control the foam with this at a party or something and not waste a keg of beer. It'll pay for itself pretty quickly if you're serving beer from a system like that. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is temperature. Temperature is the most important of the three causes of foam because it causes, or is the cause of foam, the vast majority of the time. I do a lot of troubleshooting on beer systems, get a lot of phone calls. Usually people think it's something else, and it almost always comes back to temperature. The reason they think it's something else is that they're not taking a temperature reading correctly of the beer. People assume that whatever the internal temperature of their kegerator is the temperature of the beer. If in a perfect environment where you're keeping it closed and it's not open for days, then that would probably be accurate. But they get opened and closed. You keg a beer, you put it in there, it takes a while for it to get to temperature. So it's very important to pour a beer in the glass and actually take the temperature of the beer in the glass. This is an inexpensive but very helpful thermometer that you can purchase for a few dollars. Basically with this, you just put it in the glass and you take the temperature. Now, one of the things that you want to do first is fill that glass full of very compacted ice and then put water in and then agitate it vigorously for a while and then make sure that that thermometer is reading 32 degrees. If it's not, these are very easy to calibrate. They have a wrench flats here, so you just put a wrench on it, and then you can keep it in here and move it back and forth until you get it right at 32 degrees. Then you know you're taking a proper temperature reading. So the last and third cause, major cause of foam, I should say, is the carbonation level. Carbonation level can vary depending on the style of the beer. You can also have overcarbonation just due to accidentally overcarbonating your beer. This happens a lot in homebrew. I'm sure that if you've had enough craft beers, you've opened a craft beer and poured it in the glass and it just foamed over. That's probably because that brewery overcarbonated that beer a little bit. I've found it will happen in the same brand, but different runs of it, so it's fairly common. So if you overcarbonate your beer, it's not the end of the world, but you have to remember that you want to serve it as cold as possible, and you also have to restrict it more. One of the flow control faucets is very useful for this because you can increase or decrease the restriction without having to basically take your system apart and add or subtract the amount of hose that's on it. So that's a great way to compensate for that. Beer styles are also very important for carbonation levels. An older English beer may be served at, say, 8 psi, whereas a Belgian beer might be served at 16 psi. Coors Light's a domestic beer that's served at that much higher pressure, and we see a lot of issues with foam with that beer if everything's not controlled properly. So I serve most of my beers between 10 and 12 psi. So I want to hit about 36 to 38 degrees, as we talked about, and I want to have the proper amount of restriction, which is 5 feet, a 3/16 hose minimum, or a flow control faucet. Again, this is Todd Burns. Thanks for listening to the video. Keep in mind that we have a link below with some written instructions on this that will give you a lot more details than we could do in the short video. Also, all the equipment you're seeing here can be purchased at kegconnection.com, homebrewsupply.com. You can also find out a lot more about the flow control faucets on cmbecker.com. Thanks for listening.